Everyone knows that toys are meant to bring joy to children. They should be a friend, a partner for play and rest. But what if some of them could be much more? What if their soft plastic and colorful eyes aren't just ordinary signs of a naive children's product, but hide much darker intentions? In the Baker household, there was such a toy bear, and its dark intentions were far from innocent fun. It all started when Emily, the mother of the family, brought an antique toy from a small antique shop. The bear was very beautiful, with worn but still bright amber eyes and a soft plush body. She didn't even notice how, when purchasing it, the shopkeeper had told her that it was a special item. Though the seller hadn't stated it outright, his gaze was somewhat overly serious, even unpleasant. "It will be perfect for Jake," she said to her husband when she brought the toy home. Jake, their 6-year-old son, immediately fell in love with the bear. He kept it in his crib when he woke up and even took it with him on school walks, hugging it tightly as if it were his only friend. But from the first night, something started to change. In the dark, Jake often heard whispers coming from the bear. At first, he tried to ignore it, but the whispering grew louder, and he even began to feel the little toy move on its own. During the deepest sleep, he would sometimes wake up and see the bear standing on the floor next to his bed, staring at him with its terrifying eyes. If it had been just a dream, Jake would have thought he was overreacting, but the next morning, he would find the bear not in its usual spot. The toy started to reveal itself in a completely different way. At first, it was just small things. Jake would find the bear in places where he had never left it. Then he began to notice strange cracking sounds and quiet footsteps in the dark corners of the house at night. Sometimes they scared him so much that he didn't dare leave his room when night fell. Soon, everyone in the family began to notice that something strange was happening in their home. Emily, who was usually calm and level-headed, began to see strange shadows on the walls with no physical explanation. One night, she woke up to a horrifying sound, the sound of someone sliding mercilessly down the hallway. She saw the bear moving, slowly crawling across the floor. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her due to insomnia, but in that moment, the bear turned its head and looked at her with its black eyes. Her heart froze, and she jumped out of bed. Everything happened very quickly after that. The bear instantly disappeared from the room, and when Emily went to her son, she saw that his face was pale, and his lips were as white as snow. "He came for me," Jake whispered, pointing at the bear, which was standing on a table nearby. The more they tried to banish it, the more the toy gained strength. It started to break free from wherever they left it. At night, they heard its steps growing more frequent, heading toward their bedrooms. Every time the family tried to put it back in the same corner, the bear would be somewhere else, its soft feet silently gliding over the wooden floors. The bear became not just mobile, but it also began to acquire human traits. It started altering the surrounding environment. In Jake's room, black lines appeared on the walls, changing each night as though they were trying to write their own message. Everyone began to doubt their own minds. But one night was especially terrifying. As the family slept, the lights in their house began to flicker, and cold wind started to move across the walls. They woke up to strange sounds that seemed to be music, a melody coming from the bear itself. The family saw it again. It was standing on the floor, staring at them with its large abyss-like eyes. The bear, as if waking up, began to move, slowly stepping with its feet, one by one. It was no longer like an ordinary toy, and they understood it was no longer just a toy. It had become a reflection of something dark and sinister. This was no longer just a harmless, meaningless toy. It was a being that existed only to bring death and destruction. And so, the family felt the full force of this demonic creature for the first time. With a sudden sound that tore through the night silence, the bear slowly moved across the room again, its paws softly sliding across the floor, leaving cracks behind. However, this time they were not just cracks in the wood. They were jagged, black lines that trembled and pulsed, as if in response to sounds rising from the very depths of the earth. Emily clenched her fists in fear, trying to gather herself. She knew something was wrong, but her mind refused to believe what was happening. The bear, as if deliberately, slowly turned its head toward each member of the family, seemingly peering into their very souls. This was more than just a toy. It was a demon, and it had come to take them. Mom, Jake murmured in a trembling voice, frozen in terror, unable to move. He, he wants to take me. Emily tried to place her hand on his shoulder, but something strange happened. The hand that touched him began to feel cold, as if he were surrounded by ice. She quickly withdrew her hand, and at that moment, the bear swiftly changed its position. It was now standing right in front of them, just inches away from Jake's face. "Don't touch it!" Her husband Neil shouted, grabbing the first object that came to hand, a lamp. He tried to push the bear away, but as soon as the lamp touched it, it shattered into tiny pieces, scattering across the room. The bear didn't even flinch. The family felt how the atmosphere had changed. It became thick, almost physical, as if they were surrounded by a cold smoke filling the space. Every movement became slow, hazy, as if trapped in an accelerated nightmare. Breathing became labored. They couldn't even take a step, as if invisible chains held them in place. Meanwhile, the bear, which had once been soft and friendly, began to take on a more demonic appearance. Its eyes now burned with a red fire, and its plush body seemed stretched and twisted, as though curling under an invisible force. Its paws grew claws that were so sharp they screeched like iron on stone. "It wants our souls!" Neil screamed, realizing they had no power to resist this evil. And then came the unexpected. The room began to change. The ceiling slowly began to compress, and the walls bent like a nightmarish labyrinth. Suddenly, massive cracks began to tear through the floor, and from these cracks, black threads like roots emerged, slowly wrapping around everything. The lines that had previously scratched the wood were now wide, living wounds that began to consume everything around them. The family was stunned with terror. They couldn't escape, as their feet were stuck to the floor, and the room now looked like a black pit that was gradually going to swallow them all. The bear, still standing in front of them, began to look more and more human. Was it an illusion or reality? Its face began to take on human features, each detail becoming sharper, and its mouth stretched into a smile that was impossible to forget. It wasn't just a demonic grin. It was the face of deceitful evil, drawing you into its dark abyss. "You're all mine," it whispered, and its voice now sounded hollow, like an echo from another world. "We'll be together forever." In that moment, each family member felt an icy cold wash over them. Completely unexpectedly, they saw in their minds a dark corridor leading to emptiness. It was a place with no time, no life, no death, only shadow and void. Meanwhile, the bear finally disappeared. The room returned to the way it had looked a few minutes ago. But it wasn't just the bear and its terrifying influence that vanished. Everything vanished. Everyone in the house was gone. No one will ever know where they went. From the moment the bear disappeared, the house turned into a place of terrible oblivion. The ceilings and walls no longer looked ordinary. They were now covered with dark, shimmering spots that constantly changed their appearance. They seemed to tremble under the influence of something invisible, something dark and sinister moving inside those walls. The Baker family was no longer merely present in the house. They had become a part of it, as if they had become fragments of the same dreadful dream that never ended. Each of them felt how the dark presence slowly seeped into their bodies and souls, making them feel like countless reflections of the same soul, the soul that no longer belonged to them, but to the bear. Jake, who had once been the smallest and most vulnerable, was the first to feel the changes. He woke up that night, his body seemingly limp in his crib. The shadow of the bear, though gone, had left an imprint on his psyche. He began talking to himself, pointing at the emptiness before him. "He'll be with us forever. He won't leave us now," the boy whispered, his eyes empty, expressionless. Emily, trying to understand what was happening, wandered from room to room, searching for any answer, but her gaze only met the empty walls. She even tried to go outside to reconnect with reality, but as soon as she approached the door, she saw black liquid flowing from it. It wasn't oil or paint, but something alive, predatory, like a moving black stream that wanted to consume her. "No, I can't escape," Emily whispered as her gaze lingered on the small door handles, which now looked like skeletal fingers. Neil, her husband, eventually realized that they couldn't simply leave this house. He began to study what was happening around them more deeply, trying to find any explanation. One day, while descending into the basement, he stumbled upon an old book forgotten in one of the corners. The book looked very old, with torn covers, but it was heavy as a stone. Opening it, Neil found on every page descriptions of the same shadows that had now filled their house. It was a book of spells, describing dark rituals and ancient demons who inhabited material objects, toys, old things that had once belonged to people. And the bear was one of them. He's possessed it, Neil whispered, realizing that his family had become the victims of an ancient curse. But it was too late. The bear began manipulating their senses, like a powerful magician controlling souls. Nightmares blurred with reality. Time flowed non-linearly. Days and nights merged, like fog. The floor creaked with eerie footsteps. Every sound, every movement seemed like a harbinger of something much worse. The bear was no longer just a toy. It had become their invisible companion, imposing its influence on each family member. Nothing was where it should have been. Instead of familiar things, new objects appeared in the house, objects that no one remembered bringing in. One night, when the house was engulfed in a heavy silence, Jake woke up again. He saw the bear standing in the doorway of his room, and this time, its gaze was entirely different. It was more human than ever. The bear looked at him not with aggression, but with cunning affection, almost blessing him, as if something significant was ready to consume his soul. "He's waiting for you," Jake said, staring into the bear's eyes, and at that moment his voice was no longer his own. It was the voice of someone who already belonged to the shadow. "Now you're with us. Forever." Emily and Neil tried to escape this creature, but they knew their home was no longer just a house. It had become a trap, one they had fallen into, and there was no way out. No matter what they did, the bear always returned. And with each return, it became more human, while their souls became more and more a part of it. This house was a place where two worlds merged, the world of reality and the world of terror. The bear remained, and with it remained all those who had ever fallen into its web. Over time, the Baker family realized that their connection to the bear could no longer be severed. The bear, which had become something more than just a toy, was now their shadow, their oppressive companion. Every movement in the house was accompanied by its presence. Every sound or rustle in the night silence seemed like its voice, whispering its sinister spells. The bear was no longer just a mechanical toy that moved or whispered. One night, when Jake woke from a terrible nightmare, he saw that the bear wasn't just standing by his crib, it was moving, heading toward him. Its tiny paws slid across the floor, and each step seemed like a new tear in reality. The bear's eyes didn't just gleam, they glowed with a red flame that filled the whole room. "He won't let me go," Jake whispered, his voice filled with terror and hopelessness. The boy grabbed his pillow, hoping for some kind of protection, but at that moment, the bear raised its paws, and Jake's little voice changed. "Don't fight it, Jake. You're part of me now." This voice wasn't the voice of a child. It was a deep, ominous, and firm voice that echoed in his ears, like an echo from hell. The bear drew closer, and its paws, which had once been soft and plush, now seemed metallic, like the claws of a devil. Jake felt his body freeze, and his entire being seemed to be drawn to the creature as if it were familiar, as if it were something he already knew. At that time, when the family began to realize that their existence was no longer real but just a blurry illusion, Neil found a way to confront the entity. He remembered a detail from the book of spells found in the basement. It described how to expel such evil, but it required performing a complex ritual that demanded great self-sacrifice. Neil was willing to do anything to save his family. That evening, he set himself a daunting task, to try to force the bear back into the darkness, into the world from which it had come. The ritual was simple, but incredibly dangerous. He had to place the toy on a special altar, and then recite words that would make the demons forget their desire. To do this, he would need not only magical power, but also deep feelings of self-sacrifice. "I give my soul so that you leave them," Neil uttered, gripping the bear tightly. He began repeating the words of the ritual, and in that moment, The room darkened, and black shadows began creeping out of the corners, slithering up the walls. Suddenly, everything became too intense. The shadows grew thick, like smoke, and began to constrict around Neil, coiling around him as if their dark power were devouring him. He couldn't finish the ritual because he felt his body become heavy and cold. Neil's soul began to drown in the darkness, and the bear, as if alive, squeezed his hand, turning him into its reflection. "It's too late for you," the bear whispered, and its voice grew even worse, like something you would hear only in hell. The bear not only remained in their house, but it consumed their souls, creating a new world where reality no longer existed, where they were just a part of this demonic universe. In every corner, in every nook of the house, its shadow now resided, and in each of their eyes, there was a reflection of its ominous light. At that moment, the house became merely a shell for their relentless souls. And the bear continued to watch over them, for now they were a part of his dark kingdom. This was the end for the Baker family. The bear remained, and its sinister presence became part of the house. Now, it was the master, and anyone who stepped onto this land could not escape its menacing gaze. If the horrors that engulfed the Baker family seemed unbearable, they were only the beginning of what unfolded further. The house, completely consumed by the bear's influence, became a place where reality and nightmares merged into one endless cycle. The shadows on the walls no longer merely trembled, they became visible, coming to life in the darkness, like creatures simply waiting for the moment to capture a soul. And then, when it seemed like everything was lost, something terrible happened in the middle of the night. The family felt their bodies slowly beginning to change. Their movements became different, unnatural, mechanical, like marionettes. Every gesture became overly constrained, as if their bodies no longer belonged to them. Their eyes seemed to empty, but inside each of them pulsed dark energy, filling their being, merging them with the very essence of the house. "We won't get out of here," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, as if she were already part of what surrounded them. In her eyes, scenes from when they were still alive reflected, happy moments, their laughter, shared meals. But now, it seemed like a distant illusion. Now, she was just part of the nightmare pulsing in the dark. But most of all, it was the bear that had changed. That time, when the bear returned, it was no longer just the soft toy it had been before. All the hours it had spent in the house, it absorbed more and more dark energy, and with each moment, it changed, taking on an increasingly terrifying appearance. The bear had now become gigantic, its body stretched and indistinct, like a hellish mass, constantly pulsing. Its paws were no longer plush. They had transformed into enormous skeletal tentacles capable of breaking through walls. And its eyes, red, terrifying, like two burning holes in the very heart of hell. "You thought I was just a toy? You still don't understand anything." Its voice was so loud that the entire house trembled. It seemed as though even the earth itself began to groan under its presence. The family tried to move, but their bodies no longer obeyed them. They were like puppets in the hands of a demonic master. Their steps were indistinct, and every movement brought pain, as if with each step, they were falling into the abyss. The bear began to control their consciousness. Each of them saw their own terrifying nightmares, in which they died over and over, without end, without the possibility of escape. Neil saw himself in a dark forest, where silhouettes of his family moved around him. They walked in sync, but their faces were expressionless, devoid of soul. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, he felt dark shadows slowly creeping up behind him, merging with the earth with each step. Emily saw her body begin to decay, as if it was turning to garbage. Shadows inside her tore her apart, taking every fragment of her soul. And she felt how these shadows were stealing her inner world, leaving only emptiness. But the worst part was that even when they died in their nightmares, they couldn't escape the cycle. Their bodies became lifeless shells, but their consciousness remained trapped in this hell. The bear approached them again. Its claws squeezed them, and at that moment, it screamed, "You are mine, now and forever." And each of them felt how the dark energy emanating from the bear began to penetrate their souls. It wasn't just possession. It was the final merging with it, becoming part of it in its dark, merciless power. Together, they became part of something greater, something horrifying. They could no longer be human. Now, they were eternal parts of this nightmarish creature, its consumed bodies that endlessly existed in the hellish cycle. Their home was no longer a home. It was a portal to a dark dimension that lured new victims, and anyone who crossed the threshold would become part of the same nightmare that would never end. And the bear remained, watching this endless cycle, now their eternal reality. The darkness had already become part of their existence. The bear seemed to have turned into a living nightmare, constantly pulsing in the depths of the house. Every step, every movement echoed this endless cycle. The Baker family could no longer breathe in the usual sense, their lungs filled not with air, but with dark, chemical mists that permeated every cell of their bodies. They had become part of this hellish circle, and the house was their prison, their terrifying world with no escape. But one night, when the house was flooded with a powerful black light emanating from the bear, a sound was heard, a quiet, barely audible sound. It was the sound of chains dragging across the floor, and it was familiar. It seemed that the house now had its own living entity, walking through it, creaking in the darkness. It was a sound not heard in this world. It was the essence of hell itself. Emily, who was the last conscious one, stood before the bear. Her eyes had lost their gaze, her face was pale, and her skin seemed to be decaying. She could not turn back, but even as her soul was nearly consumed, she realized something terrible. To rid herself of this, to break this cyclical nightmare, she would have to make the greatest sacrifice. She approached the bear, standing before it, and in its red eyes, she saw something that resembled pleasure. Its black claws wrapped around her, squeezing, feeling her last movements. This was not just possession, it was an exchange. The bear gathered all their final moments of life, their last memories, their pain, and grew even stronger. But Emily could no longer endure. She knew that to break the cycle, she would have to give up the last thing. "I will give everything," she whispered, and before her eyes, the images of her family involuntarily appeared. They were so close, yet so distant. She felt her heart begin to tear apart from the pain, as everything that remained was one last chance. The bear did not realize what had happened. It did not understand that its plan could be destroyed. Emily tore apart what was her last link to reality, a small piece of her soul, the remainder of herself that reflected in the very essence of her deep terror. She threw this piece into the darkness that enveloped the bear. From that moment, when her soul severed its dark connection, the bear shed its form. It was no longer the creature it had once been. Its eyes became dark, windless craters that emitted immeasurable darkness. It became shapeless, like smoke dissipating, but this smoke was not ordinary. It was alive, burning, dense. And then, something happened that even it did not expect. The hell it had created began to collapse. The house trembled from the explosion of darkness, and along with it, the very reality of this world began to disappear. The bear, feeling this catastrophe, began to uncontrollably tear apart. Its boundless darkness started to lose its strength. Emily's body fell to the floor, her last breath no longer part of the world where they had been held by its dark will. And even as the house began to crumble around them, her reflection remained forever fixed in the very place where she had been. And for a moment, while the house disintegrated into rubble, only one sound was heard, the terrible, enraged scream of the bear that filled everything. And then, silence. A few weeks later, nothing remained where their house once stood, except emptiness. The place where this dark creature had once stood became forgotten. But no one dared approach closely. Beneath the ground, deep under the rubble, in the depths of dark voids, one thing remained, the old bear, waiting for a new soul to be reborn. And even now, when the night grows longer, you can hear in the distance the quiet footsteps slowly approaching. The house that was once the baker's home no longer existed, but its dark shadows remained. The bear waited.